Hello again. It's Spencer Hess, here to finish up this long-running series on Kaitlin Curtice's Native. Before we get into this conclusion, I want to briefly recap the past 7 or so discussions we've had about the book. This all started because I was in a book club to read Native, Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. And the more I've thought about, the more it makes sense to read this book as a tale of like 2 different Kaitlin B. Curtices. I'm kind of taking a cue from an old article I really like that was once written about Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything that you can find linked to in the comments description. But the thesis of that article is that there's a more radical Naomi Klein and a social democrat, more conservative Naomi Klein playing out in both sides of the book. And there's this sort of bipolar switching between gears between the more moderate and the more radical Naomi Klein. And I think you can read Native along those lines. If you will, there's a Kaitlin B. Curtice who, wants to ask hard questions, open you up, ask about the mystery of all things. What's true? Who are we? How do we live our lives? Isn't this all interesting? And then you have what I would call Karen B. Curtice, who's much more straight, what is usually called in today's parlance, a straight social justice warrior. And it's very clear that American history is a horrific history of white supremacy and heteronormativity, and that is all clearly, absolutely very wrong. If you want more discussion about Karen culture, I would recommend Matt Christman's talk on why he claims everybody is a Karen, because we can't imagine a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, so all we can do is complain to the manager. Which leads us to the professional managerial class. We talked about them. We talked about Catherine Liu's take on virtue hoarding. You can find a pretty decent interview that Douglas Lane did with her recently, also linked to in the comments section. And we talked about therapeutic culture, first with Christopher Lasch and then with T.J. Jackson Lears. And in that, he noted the different shades of romanticism and ways to banally evade the contradictions of your social environment. And he listed these. These are from the slide from a couple weeks ago. And if you apply them to Kaitlin B. Curtice, like 80+% of them apply, that you can find in this book. You know, implicitly, there's this cult of if we will it enough, and if we fight hard enough, and if we have enough powerful experiences, and if we get in touch with nature, then explicitly we can reconnect with indigenous societies, or at least that she can, and that we can use art and cults of domesticity and femininity and raising the young to create a better future that we can all believe in. I think these are fair reads of what she's arguing for, however crudely. And I want to return, so there's this kind of inflammatory at home in the gift shop image that I put together, and I want to return to, for me, the single section of the book that really stuck with me, because it is so, I think, unintentionally revealing. She means it to communicate this profound experience in her journey towards her true identity or whatever. Again, maybe this is me being a cynical bastard, but if I'm not, then it's more revealing than she means. So let's get into it. She says that on a two-day road trip with my family a few years ago, we realized halfway through the drive that we'd passed through Shawnee, Oklahoma, near the land where I was born, the land that brought me up in my early years. As the sign for Shawnee crept up right along our path, I realized we were only a few short miles away from our tribal headquarters. This time, I wasn't the child going with my father, but the adult bringing my own 2 children into that space. We walked around the gift shop, where I looked at handmade necklaces, a basket full of braided sweetgrass, and Citizen Potawatomi Nation coffee mugs. I watched as my youngest son, Isaiah, stared at knives protected by glass doors, and as my oldest looked at necklaces with bright pink and purple beads on them. We walk through the museum, looking at pictures and models of the way things used to be, gateways to stories told again and again by our people, but not lived for a long time in our modern homes and lifestyles. We were communing with our ancestors there, letting their ways speak over us. We saw the way things are today, the way our tribe is working to remember, to return to ourselves and to our ways of knowing and understanding mystery. For just a little while, we were home in a way that is difficult to describe. For about a decade after my father left, due to the effects of assimilation and colonization, I was living a detached life, a life separated from the reality of my own identity. I was missing this essential way of knowing God, the Potawatomi way of knowing, and returning to Oklahoma on this trip reminded me that the tether of Kekmanodo stretches to meet us, often when we don't even realize it. When we got back in the car to leave Oklahoma, I mourned. I mourned a childhood that I still don't quite understand, and I mourned that I couldn't stay there longer to ask all the questions I had inside that had been waiting so long for answers. But I also left grateful, expectant for what the land might hold for me in the future. Always an invitation. Now, I don't know how that passage hit y'all, but for me, it is such a naughty in the sense of Knotty, naughty. You have all of this stuff about we're driving, then we realize we're going to go past my ancestral homes, then we got to stop, we look in the gift shop, we see necklaces and coffee mugs, we feel so at home, it's so profound. And here again, she's in full Kaitlin B, not Karen B. Curtice mode, where it's all very profound, and you would think that she's had some quasi-mystical experience, or maybe that she talked to someone, because she talks about how, she sees the way her tribe is working to remember and return to themselves and their ways of knowing and understanding mystery. And she felt at home. So she's describing this sort of interior experience, or this noetic experience. But then she doesn't really give you any substance to it other than we looked at some stuff in a gift shop and she was back at the lands that brought her up in her early years. And we're going to return to this because I think this is such a rich example of her trying to say one thing but implicitly revealing something else. And specifically, throughout all this talking, she says, I couldn't stay there longer to ask all the questions I had inside that had been waiting so long for answers. And I'm reading this thinking like, well, Kaitlin, why not? Why, what is this thing? Why can't you stay there longer? This is the whole point of the book. Maybe you would divulge any of this information instead of talking just about how you felt like it was profound to see necklaces and Potawatomi Nation coffee mugs.
Do you see where I'm going with this?
But anyway, there's not enough information given just in this book to confirm my suspicions. So I did what any journalist in an age of falling profits and austerity would do. And so I got on Twitter, where Kaitlin Curtice has over 49,000 tweets. Because I wanted to see, okay, this is what she looks like when she's written a book and she's had an editor, but what's she talking about on a day-to-day basis? What are the issues that catch her eye? And pretty quickly, you come to learn that her husband, Travis B. Curtice, also has a page, so we'll be featuring him a little bit. And again, I've said this a bunch of times, but I want to say it one more time. The point in this, yes, we're taking the Curtices as the subject matter here, but the real point of this is that millions of people, just like this couple, are out there thinking that they are leading profound progressive lives and missing the fact that they are deeply conservative and deeply implicated with the very world historical problems that they say they care deeply about. And so I have a little bit, especially as we're getting into the Twitter, I have a little bit of a queasy feeling that I'm doing some sort of like half-assed doxing, which is not really my point. My point is to use these people as case studies, as specimens, so that we can see the ways that we are therapeuticized PMC subjects and I would raise the question to you, whether or not we need to move beyond this, whether or not this is a state of immaturity that is ultimately counterproductive. So I view this as, yes, I'm looking at the Curtices, but I'm also looking in a mirror about who I am. And by looking at yourself, there's a chance that with that deeper knowledge, you can change yourself. So to me, this is the point of it. It's not to get off on feeling better about being more superior or smarter or whatever than the Curtices. Because at the end of the day, they're human beings trying to figure it out too. And I think it's important to have that level of baseline empathy. I would agree with her on that. But that also doesn't mean that we have to pretend that, they're all correct and there's no improvement and there's no place of critique. Because I think there is. So I want to just spotlight some tweets to give you a flavor of what they've done. I've curated their tweets, and I'm not convinced that they're all that noteworthy or profound, but they help to sew up the case I'm trying to make against the PMC. So we learn that, unsurprisingly, Kaitlin Curtice is opposed to indigenous mascots. She thinks they're hurtful and violent. At the beginning of February, her husband said that, quote, "I'd rather we spend our energy defending access to books written by marginalized writers than a man sharing hate speech and misinformation on Spotify," which is a dig at Joe Rogan, of course. Kaitlin likes it when Confederate statues go down, unsurprisingly. She thinks the findings of the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict of not guilty are bullshit. She has high hopes for the Biden administration's Bureau of Indian Affairs because there's indigenous folks / allies inside. And she says, quote, "This is huge, a movement of the power of the people." But there was, from what I can tell, there's been no follow-up on that, at least on her Twitter. You would think maybe she would track that a bit more. She really likes this female rabbi who gives you various, notifications of how to get more woke. Here's a choice one. She writes that your periodic reminder that not all women need access to abortion care and that some trans men and non-binary people do. Saying people who need abortion access or patient seeking care or etc. is more accurate and inclusive. So act like y'all know. There's a fair amount of virtue hoarding, especially when it comes to how we handled COVID. Left liberals love to do stuff like this. Kaitlin Curtice writes that for those who need it, put your hand on your heart and repeat after me. Making difficult decisions to keep others safe from the many dangers of a pandemic is not overreacting. Repeat as necessary. Then there's a heart and a fist emoji. I assume it's not a white power fist, but it is a white fist. So similarly, her husband has a couple tweets. One where he puts out this little press release saying that they scheduled their kiddos' COVID-19 vaccinations and that he's thankful for the scientists who made this possible. There's another one where he writes that as a general rule, if you are talking on the phone about how you were just exposed to COVID, pull the mask over your nose and mouth. It does very little on your chin, especially during elementary school pickup. This is a tweet that's easy to pick apart. Like, as a general rule, it's also probably not all that productive to talk shit on people on Twitter. And also the grammar of, does it do more than a little on your chin if you're not at an elementary school pickup? But I digress. Her husband has surprisingly milquetoast views on this whole Putin-Ukrainian war debacle. Even so far as calling him out as being a war criminal, which fair enough, but also it's strange for an American to accuse other countries of whatever. But this is what left liberalism does with your brain. It rots it. She makes fun of Republicans and conservative Christians. Fair enough, whatever. And then now we're hitting the more banal tweets of hers. She lets people know that Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart have a new Halloween baking competition show on Peacock, which I think is NBC's streaming service. For a radical, she watches a strange amount of mainstream television. She tweets at Target about how big and cool their mugs are. She binge watches various TV shows, including The Golden Girls. Her husband was looking to buy a farm for sale with 200 acres just north of the city they live in, and she shut it down for reasons I don't understand. Like, wouldn't you want to be in touch with the land? Think of all the trees that she could talk to. Maybe her ancestors could reach her through them. Why would she shut that down? It's unclear. But a sort of contrasting tweet is she writes about how doing a bedtime meditation last night on how we'll decorate a travel bus for road trips. The oldest kid says he would give us each a room, and my room would have a big desk in the corner and a wall covered in all the Potawatomi words. They get me. And then she has this gif, also from NBC, from some show, I don't know, saying, "I'm honored." And to me, these two tweets together, when you're just scrolling through these, it's like, okay, so she doesn't want to live on a farm, but she wants a travel bus, and it would be really cool if it was like all outfitted out with Potawatomi stuff. And she thinks this so much that she's tweeting this to the world at large. I can't relate. And I'm not opposed to if people want to go on a road trip, or it's fine to decorate stuff with imagery and art that you find important. Like, I'm not objecting to that, but to me it's one more example of how you want to like have this radical change, but also you want to lead this comfy middle class life. So much so that you don't want to live on an old farm surrounded by nature. She describes what it's like to be an author. There's a couple of tweets up here. I'll just read one. She writes, "Despite what TV shows, writing isn't just the writing part. It's drinking/eating and thinking. It's reading books and thinking. It's crying. It's processing trauma. It's sleeping and thinking. It's jumping out of the shower to write a thought down. It's crying more. It's everything." And here's an example of how her personal practice is tied up in therapy. And there's a whole lot of therapeutic tweets. So many, in fact, that if you're watching the video of this, you'll just have to pause if you want to read these as I scroll through them. But just to give you a sample, one tweet she writes says, "Happy weekend. Today, can you check in with your body? Ask them what they need. Consider new boundaries that need to be set. Or take a break from certain spaces, situations, or people. Trust your body to let you know. Let them lead." Another couple is when she writes things like, "So I'd love to know, what or who has helped you learn to trust yourself? What have you learned in the process? What kindness can you speak to your wounded child self today? That's what I long to know. What the world longs to experience for you." Other times she's more spicy and fed up with people. And this might be my all-time favorite tweet of hers, where she says, "Dear human readers," I would encourage you to try that out in your life. Just "Dear human blank." It's quite a way to refer to people. "Dear human readers, your favorite memoir/essayist authors are not also your personal therapists. Please do not treat us as such, or put these kinds of expectations on us."
If there's a scale from 1 to even, I can't. That's a lot.
I also kind of want to know, are there non-human readers that reckon Kaitlin Curtice among their favorite memoir/essayist authors? I'd really like to know. And I would also like to put out an open letter. I'll just insert it here. It says, "Dear feline listeners, your favorite political philosophy adjunct lecturer is ready and willing to listen to your traumas and to affirm that you are heard, that you are seen, that you are valid, that you are just the cutest and or the handsomest, that you are all that you are and more and more." And then we get to the more professional stuff, shall we say. You can find... Here's a representative quote from Kaitlin Curtice saying, "Do you ever feel like society requires you to put yourself on display in order to survive? How do we reclaim our own humanity in a society that asks us to do this constantly?" And it's a valid question, and she's making my point, and she's not like, how do we change society? It's just, how do we maintain some baseline level of human decency in the midst of an inhuman society? And if you want the answer to that, subscribe to her Substack. Similarly, you can find her husband promoting either his papers or papers of grad students or colleagues or what have you in the international relations sphere of things. And one of the standout things about all this to me is that my earlier theory about the Kaitlin and Karen B. Curtice dichotomy basically plays out inside of her Twitter world as well. What most of these things that aren't totally banal or totally personal boil down to is some mixture of Kaitlin B. Curtice's therapeutic, we'll be gentle and let's talk about our trauma. And then it can flip and you get the Karen who's like, don't bother me with your psychological problems. Keep your white supremacy out of here and rip those Confederate statues down. And this brings us to our discussion on obscenity. Obscenity as a concept that we tend to take for granted, but I want to slow down and break down what obscenity is in finer detail, because I think it explains a lot of what I've been trying to hone in on in these talks. So most of us are familiar with the primary definition of obscenity, which runs as, quote, the portrayal or description of sexual matters offensive or disgusting by accepted standards of morality and decency. That's the one most of us are familiar with. Now, there is a secondary one that people claim comes from Greek etymology, specifically the Greek obscene, meaning off-scene, which means that it was acts that were not meant to be put on the stage. They were off stage. And usually that had more to do with murder than it did sex because, I don't know, they hadn't absorbed Judeo-Christian sexual mores. And then, of course, there's the classic from former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart that you just know it when you see it. And if ever there was an expression of American philosophical pragmatism and subjectivism, I suppose it's that. But I want to focus on this middle obscure definition, because a huge part of Kaitlin's writing, both on her Twitter and in her book, is to look at what is on scene in mainstream American history. So she wants to look at mainstream American conservatism, and especially as it's been handed down to us from the quote-unquote Reagan coalition. So the synthesis of traditional Judeo-Christian values with economic liberalism and militant anti-communism. And of course these have been somewhat updated in our times. It's less anti-communism than anti-democrat, but the boundaries are blurry, right? So she wants to critique that. She wants to look at the mainstream narratives we have about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue, and the American Revolutionary War, and Americans' Puritan Protestant history. She wants to critique manifest destiny and westward expansion and the romanticization of that in things like John Wayne and our valorization of presidents. And she wants to show that there's a direct link between George Washington and Donald Trump, that they're all of a piece. She wants to show the hypocrisy behind our fetishization of liberty and the Pax Americana and apple pie and the reign of money. She wants to critique that. So in a way, she wants to clean out America's closet and show all of the horrific things we've done. She's trying to, in a way, invert it. So what was off scene in the past or taken as granted from this mainstream American perspective? We don't like to dwell too much on genocide of the natives or slavery or witch hunts or systematic misogyny or exploitative industrial systems that degraded America's ecology and led to things like the Dust Bowl. Right? So she wants to flip the things. All the things that were sort of at the material base of America, that we don't like to deal with because it's dark and it's violent and it's contradictory with our stated values. She wants to flip it and say, don't you see how bad this is? We need to feel bad about it, and then we need to change. And we're not going to think about it any more than change, but we all need to agree that we need to change. And the main reason we all can't change is because there are people that can't admit any of this is bad. And then what she's hoping to do, I think, is that we're all going to feel very bad and cry now that we've seen all of the off-scene stuff that she has now centered, quote unquote. And then when we encounter her indigenous identity and her decolonial, vaguely green politics, and then when we avail ourselves of gender fluid, non-binary literature, as we consume more entertainment that includes marginalized peoples and identities and cultures, then somehow or other we're going to riot, burn the stage down, and we're going to build a new stage of world peace, and it will all be awesome. And that, in a nutshell, is sort of this, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, the Kaitlin, Karen B. Curtice, I'm arguing. But I'm also arguing that she too has the... And this is what I find so prescient about this at home in the gift shop section, because you can see, there's the stage that she wants to show, and then you can see these flitting shadows of what's going on behind the scenes. So just to briefly fly back over this section, how did they not realize until a day into their 2-day road trip that they would go right through her ancestral lands or tribal lands because they were forcefully relocated? And then she has this section in the middle where she talks about how profound it was to be in the gift shop and be in the museum and remember how things used to be. And then after all this, she's sad because they have to go. They couldn't stay there any longer, which for me is like the glaring question. Like, what do you mean? This is about your identity. This is a paramount thing. This is what your book was written about. But she's like, nope, we got to go. That's just the fact of the matter. But she also got to leave grateful and expectant for what the land might hold for the future. Always something new. There's always the development of progress. But in the meantime, I'm like, but what are you doing? What is off stage? And I've got to be honest, I've thought long and hard about this. I've checked my math a bunch. And underlying all this therapeutic stuff, I can come to no other conclusion that the only thing holding all of these unstated things together is, even under all the radical, allegedly leftist politics, what we're dealing with here is a Democrat at therapy. And the answer of where did she have to go? Why did she have to leave this profound experience with her native people? Well, back to the suburbs. And maybe not. I get the sense perhaps they live in the city proper, but my point still stands. Back to middle-class affluence, which, by her own admission, is due to the effect of assimilation and colonization. But I would argue the way this all holds together, then why her... if not explicitly pro-Democrat politics, although I would argue implicitly, is that why her anti-Republican politics? And why is that? I suspect, and maybe this is too psychologizing, but this makes sense and it fits with other PMC types I've grown up around, is that because as a way to ameliorate their guilt, what you do is you hate your neighbors who are mostly like you, but slightly different. And then you blame your neighbors in the suburbs for what's wrong with the world instead of, well, why are you even in the suburbs in the first place? And to be clear here, I'm not referring to their literal neighbors. I don't know anything about them. I suspect that they don't have much relationship with their neighbors, and to the extent they do, they believe more or less the same thing that the Curtices do. But because everybody is participating in this national media climate, your enemy neighbors are the Republicans that live in suburbs somewhere else, probably in the middle and south of the country. And that her relationship with these people is probably more intimate than her actual neighbors. And I would submit, along taking the thesis from Matt Christman's Grill Stream Kush Vlogs, is that what American politics is, and especially as it grows more polarized and acrimonious, is just the spectacle of the disintegration between the people like in this photo that were pointing guns at the BLM protesters walking by their house in the suburbs in St. Louis and the Curtices. I would submit that instead of an AR and whatever pistol she's got, her husband has a budding academic career and she has a Substack and 49,000 tweets. And so if you're wondering, what is the perhaps Marxian takeaway? What would be the Marxian verdict? She's a bruncher who identifies as being opposed to the boaters. And she's, outside of her role as a wife and mother, which is a good and worthwhile thing to do with your life, her alleged politics is a kind of small-scale grift, where she's either leading people on with the fact that this is going to lead to something productive, or she's hyping herself up to feel like she's leading a more adventurous and radical life than it seems like she actually is. Put another way, it's a kind of woke version of Cartman's famous business plan from episode 1, season 18 of South Park.
Maybe we need a name that's more affirming, like shows what we stand for. We don't stand for anything. Remember our company plan, guys. Start up, cash in, sell out, bro down.
Now, to be fair, her version of the startup cash in, sell out, bro down plan looks like starting up a small Substack, cashing in by investing her time and energy, selling out on, I would assume, a relatively small amount of books and subscribers, but who knows. And then have a hobby to hang out on Twitter with your radical friends at a distance. But for some people, this is a pleasurable way to live their life. But to be fair and give even coverage, she has a kind of defense of herself that she recently posted on her Twitter. She writes, "Hi. So for those of you new to my writing, or if you've read my books already, I want to point out a few things that I've noticed really bother some readers who've grown up with linear Western thinking. First, I get negative reviews of my writing from people who say it's too repetitive, and they didn't like it because it wasn't clear. Storytelling traditions that are born in and continue to grow through non-linear, cyclical stories are this way, and we should embrace it. Am I asking Western thinkers, especially white folks, to adapt? Yes. Yes, I am. There are cultures all over the world that have thrived and survived using seasonal/cyclical ways of life, and we need to learn to embrace and celebrate that today, especially in Western white Christianity. Second, I've noticed that people are really uncomfortable with the fact that, at least in #NativeBook, and surprise, in my new book too, I give you a lot more questions than answers. That's because I believe you have the answer/gifts inside of you. Take some time to find them. A lot of Western/linear thought and culture is what we want streamlined. A lot of Western/linear thought and culture is that we want streamlined answers and we want them now. Sorry, I won't give you that. It's not a how-to guide, but an invitation to search, to unlearn, to tell the truth, and to see what might happen in your life from there. Here are some questioning statements I make in Native. Maybe we can remember that this land is still sacred, that it is still space that we should inhabit while honoring it, and people who care for it. Maybe we are all just barely getting started. Maybe we are all transforming. Do you get what I mean? While we should and can tell the truth, we should also hold on to the power of curiosity in our lives, gently asking ourselves what's next, and not being afraid to jump in, create change, fix it when we mess up, and keep going. One more thing that you should know about my writing. It may not be possible, but I strive to write books that a lot of different people can read. True, you're of course getting my perspective, but I hope my words/books hold space for the reader, whoever you may be. My goal in writing is to help stretch you and myself. for us to enter into a wider understanding of love, of the divine, of the sacred in and around us. That's where I live every day, and my hope is that we break through barriers of white supremacy as we enter that together. So when I write about decolonization as an invitation, I'm literally talking about this. Even the way you read my books, opening yourselves up to new ways of understanding the world and peoples around you. That is rejecting colonial ways of reading/listening. Onward. And it's tough because as I read this, if I didn't have the experience of reading the native book and through trudging through 9 months worth of her tweets, the whole enterprise sounds much more pleasant than it was to me. Now, the easy out for her would be, well, that's because she's just seriously challenging my white supremacist notions, including the idea that thinkers should be clear and say something that gives and say something that has obvious implications or import, instead of just asking open-ended questions repetitively and allowing us to figure it out for ourselves, but also insisting that there's certain basic things like the historical reality of colonialism that we must feel bad about and we must admit are wrong. And we must take serious action to rectify that past. But she's also not going to tell us what those actions are because it's all a very intimate personal journey and we're all meant to figure it out separately together. And the other relevant Marxian critique is what these products do functionally, on top of providing grist for the mill of cultural debates between boaters and brunchers from the privileged echelons within capitalism. But it also creates new novel markets for people to participate in and try and realize their identity and find themselves through the consumption of products. A case in point from an NBC late night talk show that I found through her Twitter that she cited approvingly.
The thing, we as artists and consumers have to be extra careful in how we treat Native people because our country has not been. The Amber Ruffin Show is filmed on the traditional land of the Lenape peoples, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. It is our duty. It's our duty to make sure Indigenous women are depicted with care and integrity, and more importantly, make sure they get a chance to depict themselves. That means supporting Native women in everything from writers' rooms to boardrooms. It means donating to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. It means supporting positive Native representation by watching shows like Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls.
And with that, enough said. On to the Christian-Anarchist critique. I take the rational core of Christian anarchism to take Christ practicing throughout his life and ministry and death and resurrection, self-sacrificial love, and even to the point of dying instead of taking up arms and trying to wield political power and or kill his enemies. Christians, as people called to follow that example, are called to do a few things. One of which is to, I think, still try and organize at every level that they can, life-giving and loving communities and institutions. The other aspect that I think comes from this is giving up aesthetically, as it were, renouncing scapegoating and not blaming other people for the problems of the world in general, and especially issues that you are complicit in. At least this is the ideal, to accept responsibility for our role in, let's say, white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and then trying to both personally and politically, perhaps, at least at the local level, organize to create a better, more theocentric social order. And this is a little abstract. I want to tell two quick history lessons. One, on December day of 800 AD, the Pope at the time crowned Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. And the idea here, as shown in this painting, is that the Pope is the emissary, as Christ's vicar, if we follow good Catholic theology, as God's representative. The Pope or the priest is a mediator, pontifex, between the divine realm and the human world, between the divine and the profane. But the idea is that Charlemagne's earthly temporal rule is granted through this divine mandate. Now it's not yet to a fully modern divine right of kings, enlightened absolutism. It's a little bit more instinctual and vague, but there is something of this idea that there is a chain of being and temporal rule is grounded in divine sanction. You cut to 1804 AD, and Napoleon, once the Pope at his coronation, and hence in this famous painting of the coronation, the Pope is sitting down though, and he's sort of blessing the ceremony from afar. But if you'll notice, Napoleon is crowning himself, or in this portrait specifically, Josephine. But now the notion seems to be that Napoleon is his own divine and or secular source of authority, that it just comes instinctively from his own personality. And I think this is something of what Alistair McIntyre is talking about in After Virtue, where he writes that whether we view this decisive moment of change as loss or liberation, and he's talking a shift from a world where we are embedded in a wider rational divine law and natural law, to one in which law we think flows from us, and we know things are true and right because we feel that they're true and right. He says, whether we view this as a loss or liberation, as a transition to autonomy or anomie, which more or less just means like chaos and disorganization, two features of it need to be emphasized. The first is the social and political consequences of the change. Abstract changes in moral concepts are always embodied in real particular events. There is a history yet to be written in which the Medici princes, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, Frederick the Great and Napoleon, Walpole and Wilberforce, Jefferson and Robespierre, are understood as expressing in their actions, often partially in a variety of different ways, the very same conceptual changes which at the level of philosophical theory are articulated by Machiavelli and Hobbes, by Diderot and Condorcet, by Hume and Adam Smith. So he's talking about the shift from sort of Platonic and Aristotelian reason governing society, at least theoretically, to one in which concerns of economy and brute power come more and more to the fore. And I bring all this up because circling around this question of what's real, are there divine and natural laws, or is it just whatever we feel? This whole question is fully left unresolved by Kaitlin B. Curtice, and my argument would be she naively wants to have it both ways. She wants us to be liberal individuals, little Napoleons, if you will. But also, if any of us little Napoleons decide that we belong to our ethnic group origins, then we should all celebrate that, as long as that doesn't infringe on other people's ability to submit to overarching theoretical understandings. And I think this is important because one of the things that really stuck with me about the book was her discussion, as I discussed in the first talk, about Elizabeth Warren, and the quote about to be a good relative, to be fully kin. We must put that relatedness into thoughtful and respectful practice, individually and collectively, and take up our responsibilities to one another and to the world of which we're a part. But the problem is that whole sentence is freighted with, in the abstract, to be a relative or fully kin, relatedness. This is all very abstract. But as soon as you try and put that into practice, well, what's thoughtful and respectful practice? What does it mean to collectively belong to any entity? And what are our responsibilities to one another and to the world of which we're a part? And without some sort of framework, I don't think you can have a coherent answer. And of course, she would say, well, I'm not about the answer. I'm just about asking the question. And to that I say, fine. Unfortunately for all of us, world history isn't a safe space where the PMC gets to hold on to their pensions and their vacations and their Peacock subscriptions at no cost to everybody else.